My son-in-law walked into a courtroom and asked a judge to strip me of my own life. Too confused to run my shop, he told them. Too forgetful to sign my own name. He had no idea I had built that confusion myself, piece by piece, ever since the morning I found my dead wife's handwriting folded inside a stranger's watch. I sat in the waiting room in my good shirt and asked myself the only question that mattered that day. Was I really losing my mind? Or was I the only one left holding the truth? The Presidio County Courthouse smelled like old paper and window cleaner. I had been inside that building twice before in 66 years. Once to renew a business license, once to file paperwork after my wife's estate closed. I had never once sat outside a courtroom waiting to learn whether a stranger in a black robe would decide I no longer owned my own mind. Renata Ose sat beside me with a folder 3 inches thick. Inside it was everything I had spent 5 months proving one small fact at a time, the way you true up a gear train tooth by tooth, instead of trying to force the whole mechanism at once. Across the hall, behind a door with frosted glass, Grant Farrow was already filing his own paperwork. He was asking the court to name him guardian of my affairs. He was not doing it because he loved me. He was doing it because in 90 days a loan he could not repay was coming due, and the collateral behind that loan was a watch shop that had belonged to my family for 3 generations, along with one particular timepiece inside it that Grant understood far less than he believed he did. The petition itself ran 4 pages. I had read it twice before we ever left the truck. It said I had missed 2 appointments in March. It said I had told a long-time customer her father's pocket watch was her grandfather's and confused the 2 men entirely. It said I had damaged the escapement on a Hamilton Railroad watch I should have been able to service with my eyes closed. It said I lived alone, that my daughter had voiced real concern for my safety, and that a man of my age and medical history should not be handling fine tools, strong magnification, and parts small enough to vanish between careless fingers. Every sentence of it carried the specific, careful weight of a document written by someone who had watched closely and taken notes. Every word of it was also true. That was the part Grant never understood, not once, not even at the very end. Nobody had framed me. I had built the entire performance myself, appointment by appointment, dropped screwdriver by dropped screwdriver, because 5 months earlier, I had learned something that made me need him to believe I had stopped paying attention to anything at all. What I had learned had not come from a private investigator or a forensic accountant, though eventually both would be involved. It came from 4 folded notes hidden inside 4 wristwatches that had been sitting unfinished on my workbench since before my wife died, waiting on customers who had stopped calling because grief had taught me to leave that particular corner of the bench untouched for 1 year and 8 months. I did not open those 4 watches because I suspected anything. I opened them because I was performing forgetfulness for an audience, and a forgetful old man rediscovering neglected work was exactly the kind of detail that made the performance convincing. I had no idea reaching for the first one that my wife had left me something other than grief inside it. Renata checked her watch, the ordinary quartz kind, and told me the judge was running 11 minutes behind. I nodded and did not say anything because there was nothing left to say that the folder in her lap did not already say better. Down the hall I heard Grant's voice for just a moment, low and confident, the voice of a man who still believed the morning belonged to him. It did not, though. He had no way of knowing that yet. And neither, in a way, did I. Whatever the judge decided in the next hour would only close one door. It would not answer the larger question. The one that had been sitting under everything since the day the first note fell out of that watch case and landed face up on my workbench, like something dropped on purpose from very far away. A conservatorship once granted does not leave much behind for the person it is granted over. Renata had explained it to me plainly the first week I hired her, the way she explained everything without softening a fact just because it was hard to hear. Grant would control my accounts. He would control the shop's finances, its inventory, any sale or loan against it. He would control, on paper at least, me. The law calls it protection. I had learned by then that the word protection means something different depending on which side of the paperwork you are standing. The court would not decide today whether Grant's petition succeeded. Today was only a hearing, the first of what Renata expected to be 2, maybe 3, depending on what the judge wanted to see. But Grant's attorney had asked for an expedited medical evaluation, citing my age and what he called a rapid decline. And expedited was the word that mattered. Grant did not need a final ruling. He needed enough time and enough doubt to keep the bank from calling his loan before he could refinance it using something he no longer legally owned. I had known this hearing was coming for 6 weeks. I had spent 5 of those weeks not telling Renata everything I knew, which was, I understood, even then, its own kind of dishonesty. The same species as the one I had been practicing on my daughter and my son-in-law since the spring. I had my reasons. Some evidence once shown too early gives the other side time to build an answer for it. I had learned that much from 40 years of estimating jobs I did not want to lose to a lower dishonest bid. To understand why I was willing to let a judge believe I might be losing my mind, you have to go back to where this actually started. Not in this courthouse, and not with Grant. 20 months earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday morning on Elm Street, before I had any reason to distrust the man who had married my daughter, and before I understood that the quietest people in a family are often the ones keeping the most careful accounts. The clock in the front window of my shop has not moved in 20 months. Customers ask about it sometimes. A tall mahogany regulator with a painted moon face, the kind of piece that should never sit dead in a working watchmaker's window. I tell them it is waiting on a part. That is a lie I have told so many times it barely counts as one anymore. The truth is I stopped that clock myself on purpose on the worst morning of my life, and I have not once wound it since. That morning started like any other Tuesday on Elm Street. I opened the shop at 7, same as always, and set 4 watches on the bench in the order I meant to work them. A regulator movement for a rancher named Coburn, a ladies' Elgin that needed a new mainspring, 2 wristwatches waiting on parts that had not yet arrived. Lorraine was upstairs in the apartment we kept above the shop, going through the ledger the way she did every Tuesday month, because bookkeeping had been hers since the year we married, and she trusted no one else with it, including me. She had been sick for 11 months by then. Cancer, the kind the doctors in Alpine called treatable right up until the week they stopped calling it that. She still came down most mornings anyway, sat at the little desk by the register with her reading glasses and a mechanical pencil, and worked through invoices while I worked through watches, the 2 of us in the same room. The way we had been in some form or another for 41 years. At 9:15 she called down the stairs that a number in the March column would not balance. I told her I would look at it after I finished the Coburn regulator. She said that was fine and asked if I wanted coffee, and I said yes, and that was the last complete conversation my wife and I ever had. Though neither one of us knew it at the time, which I have since decided is the only mercy that morning offered either of us. At 9:40, I heard something upstairs that was not a footstep and was not a chair. I have tried since then to describe that sound to exactly one person, and I could not do it, and I am not going to try again here. I went up the stairs faster than I have moved in 20 years. I found her on the kitchen floor beside the desk, the ledger still open, the mechanical pencil still in her hand. I called for an ambulance from Alpine, 40 minutes out on a good day. And I called our neighbor, a rancher's wife named Delphine, who had some nursing training from her army years. And I did everything a person is supposed to do, in the order a person is supposed to do it. And none of it mattered. Lorraine Ashcroft died on our kitchen floor at 10:06 in the morning, on an ordinary Tuesday, with the March column still not balanced. I want to tell you what I felt standing over her. But I am not going to, because that is not the part of this story that matters to what came later. What matters is what happened downstairs in the shop while the ambulance was still 40 minutes out, and I was sitting on the kitchen floor because my legs had stopped agreeing to hold me up. The regulator clock in the front window runs on a weight-driven movement that needs winding every 8 days. I had wound it the previous Tuesday, same as always, and it should have run another 6 days at least before it needed attention again. When the funeral director's assistant came by that evening to help me close up the shop, she noticed the clock had stopped. 10:06. Exactly. I did not wind it back up that night, or the next, or any night since. I told myself for a long time that it was simple coincidence, an old weight-driven movement finally giving out after decades of use, nothing more than a mechanical part reaching the end of its service life at an unfortunate hour. I am a man who has spent his whole career explaining that machines do not have opinions. I still believe that. I let the clock stay stopped anyway. Lorraine had never trusted the bank's own printed statements, not fully. She cross-checked every deposit against her own paper ledger by hand every single month for as long as I had known her, and she had caught 2 bank errors over the years doing it. Small ones, but she was proud of both. She used to say that numbers do not lie, but the people who type them in sometimes do, and a person who wants to catch a lie has to be willing to do the boring work of checking. I did not think about that habit again for 18 months. I have thought about almost nothing else since. Josephine flew in from Santa Fe 2 days later, and I remember almost nothing about that week except her hand on my shoulder at the funeral home, and the specific useless fact that she had forgotten to change out of her travel clothes before coming straight from the airport. Grant did not come until the funeral itself. He said the timing had not worked with his schedule. I did not think much of it then. I had a great many other things occupying the part of my mind that might have noticed. He arrived in a dark suit that fit him better than any suit at that funeral home had any business fitting, shook my hand for exactly the correct amount of time, and spent the reception afterward on his phone in the parking lot for what Josephine told me later was a call about a close in Santa Fe that could not wait. I noted it. I did not weigh it. A man burying his mother-in-law is not generally looking for reasons to distrust his son-in-law's phone habits, and I was not an exception to that rule. What I did not know that week, and would not know for another 18 months, was that Lorraine had spent some portion of the previous few months writing things down that had nothing to do with the March column or any other column in that ledger. She had written them somewhere else entirely, somewhere she knew I would eventually find them, because she knew me well enough after 41 years to know exactly what kind of grief would keep me away from that particular corner of my own workbench for a very long time. She was right. It kept me away for 1 year and 8 months. And when I finally went back 5 months before that hearing in Presidio, I was not looking for anything she had left me. I was only trying to look busy enough and forgetful enough for an audience of one man, who was watching me far more closely than I had ever bothered to watch him. 8 months after my wife's funeral, on an afternoon I would not remember at all if not for what it cost me, I signed away partial control of my shop and did not know it. I want to say it took some elaborate scheme to make that happen, something a smarter man could not have fallen for. It did not. It took 4 minutes, a manila folder, and a son-in-law who understood exactly how much attention a grieving old man pays to paperwork when someone he trusts is standing over his shoulder saying it is nothing important. Grant came by on a Thursday afternoon in August, on his way, he said, from Marfa's small regional airport back to Santa Fe after a client meeting. I had not seen him in 6 weeks. He came in wearing the kind of casual clothes that cost more than my good suit, carried a leather portfolio under one arm, and told me he had been thinking about me, alone in the shop all these months, and wanted to make sure I was protected. Protected was the word he used. I have turned it over in my mind more times than I could count since. At the time, it sounded like exactly what it was supposed to sound like, which was kindness. Grant had taken to handling small pieces of paperwork for me in the months since Lorraine died. A renewal on the shop's general liability policy in April, a change of beneficiary form for a small retirement account in June, one I barely remembered having. Each time he brought the document already filled out, already reviewed by whichever attorney his firm kept on retainer, and each time I signed it in under 5 minutes because that was as far as I understood it. The entire point of having a son-in-law who worked in finance and real estate and understood forms that made my head hurt. Lorraine had always handled that side of our life. Grant had simply quietly stepped into the space she left. He set the portfolio on my workbench, which was a mistake on his part, though I did not recognize it as one until much later. The bench was covered in loose gears and a partially disassembled chronograph movement, and Grant, a man who kept his own desk in Santa Fe so clean it looked staged for a magazine, clearly wanted to get his papers signed and get off that bench as quickly as he could manage it. "There is insurance paperwork I need you to look at," he said. "Emergency coverage for the shop, in case anything happens while you're running things alone out here." Josephine's been worried. I told her I'd handle it so she wouldn't have to bother you about it. I remember being grateful for that last part. Josephine had called twice that month, sounding tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and the idea that Grant was taking something off her plate, rather than putting something on mine, was the exact kind of thought a man wants to have about his daughter's husband. He opened the portfolio and laid a document on top of my scattered gears, and before I had done more than glance at the top line, he set a second folder down across the lower two-thirds of the page. "Just some other reference material," he said, tapping the second folder without moving it. "You don't need to read past the coverage terms up top. It's standard boilerplate. Below that, same language every insurer uses." I read the coverage terms up top. They said what he told me they would say, something about equipment replacement value and business interruption coverage numbers that sounded reasonable for a shop my size. I did not lift that second folder to read what was underneath it, because I had a chronograph movement in pieces on the other half of my bench and a man standing across from me who had, as far as I knew that day, never once given me a reason to check his work. "Where do I sign?" I asked him, and he turned to a signature line near the bottom that was conveniently just below where his reference folder ended, and I signed my name the way I have signed it my entire adult life. Wendell J. Ashcroft. The J for Josiah, my father's name before it was mine. He asked while I was signing how business had been that quarter. "Slower in summer," I told him. "Same as always. Tourists thin out once the heat sets in properly." He asked whether I had thought about expanding, taking on an apprentice maybe, looking at a line of credit against the building, to modernize the shop's equipment. I said I had not thought much about any of that, and he said that was fine, no rush, just wanted to understand where things stood. I did not think at the time that a man asking about my shop's finances while I signed emergency insurance paperwork was doing anything other than making conversation. I understand now that he was doing both things at once, and that the conversation was not separate from the paperwork, that the two had been planned together down to the order of the questions. It was reconnaissance conducted in the same 4 minutes as the theft, because Grant did not believe in wasting a trip, and he never once in all the years I knew him wasted one. He collected both folders the moment my pen left the page, squared them into his portfolio with 2 efficient taps against the workbench, and told me he would file the copy with his own paperwork so I would not have to think about it again. I thanked him. I actually thanked him, and I want that fact recorded plainly because it is the detail I have had the hardest time forgiving myself for. He was at the door before I had even wiped the pen down and set it back in its holder. "Don't worry about the details, Dad," he said, using the word he used maybe 4 times a year, always at moments like this one. "You just keep fixing your watches. I'll handle the paperwork from here on out." I went back to the chronograph movement on my bench, and I thought, for perhaps the length of one full breath, that I was a fortunate man to have a son-in-law willing to shoulder that kind of thing, a man other fathers-in-law would envy. Then I picked up my tweezers and forgot about it entirely, the way you forget about any ordinary Thursday afternoon, because nothing about it had felt like the kind of hour a person needs to remember. My granddaughter closed her sketchbook that night and did not open it again for 6 weeks. I did not understand until much later how much that single fact told me about everything that happened at the gallery, more than any of the words that were actually spoken out loud in that room. Because Nora Farrow had been drawing something new every single day since she was 4 years old. And the night she stopped was the same night her father decided in front of 40 strangers exactly how much my life's work was worth. The Marfa Open, they called it. An annual exhibition the town ran every October to draw collectors down from Santa Fe and Houston. Held that year in a converted airplane hangar on the edge of town, with white walls and track lighting, and a bar serving wine most of the guests could not have priced correctly if asked. Grant had a small stake in the gallery, running it some arrangement through his investment fund that I never fully understood, and at the time had no reason to try to. The hangar still smelled faintly of the crop dusting operation it had once housed, underneath the newer smells of candle wax and expensive perfume, and somebody had hung a row of enormous canvases along the back wall that I could not begin to interpret, and did not try to. I recognized perhaps 6 faces in that entire room, and every one of them belonged to someone who had at some point sold Grant something or bought something through him, which told me more about the guest list than anyone had bothered to tell me directly. I wore the suit I had worn to Lorraine's funeral, the only suit I owned that still fit properly. And I came because Josephine asked me to, and because Nora had been talking about it for 2 weeks, about the drawing she wanted to show me. One she had done of the regulator clock in the shop window, the stopped one, sketched from memory, with the hands frozen at 10:06. Exactly. A detail she had gotten right without my ever telling her the significance of that particular hour. She found me near the entrance before Grant had even finished his second circuit of the room, pulled a folded page from the sketchbook she carried everywhere, and held it up with both hands, the way a person presents something they are proud of and a little afraid to show at the same time. "Look, Grandpa Robert," she said, "though my name is Wendell." A habit she had picked up somewhere and never dropped. Everyone called their grandfather Robert in a book she liked. "I fixed the moon face, too. Can you tell?" I could tell. I told her so, and I was in the middle of telling her exactly which line she had gotten wrong on the pendulum bob when Grant's hand landed on her shoulder from behind. Not roughly, never roughly, that was never his method, just firm enough to turn her half around and end the conversation without appearing to end anything at all. "Sweetheart, not right now," he said. "Mr. Vandermeer wants to meet you." And then he looked past her at me, at the suit, at the hands that 50 years of tools had left permanently marked in ways no amount of soap ever fully addressed. And something in his face did the smallest possible recalculation. The kind you would miss if you were not watching for it, which by then I had started to be. Nora did not argue. She folded the drawing back along its crease and slid it into the sketchbook and let her father steer her toward a cluster of adults near the far wall without a word of protest, the particular silent compliance of a child who has learned faster than any child should have to exactly which requests get honored in a room like that one and which do not. I watched her go. I did not follow. There was nothing useful I could have done by following. He introduced me to exactly one couple that evening, a pair of Houston collectors standing near the wine table. And he did it with a sentence I have not been able to forget since, delivered lightly, almost warmly, the way you deliver something you have rehearsed enough times that it no longer feels rehearsed to you. "This is Josephine's father," he said. "He keeps the old traditions alive out here. Hands-on work, the kind of thing you don't see much of anymore. Real heritage craft." The woman smiled, the particular smile people give a museum placard. Neither of them asked me a single question after that. Heritage craft. I turned that phrase over for a long time afterward, the way you turn over a word that has been used correctly and still manages to take something away from you. He was not wrong. He was simply speaking about my life's work the way a man speaks about something already finished, already safely in the past tense, something you preserve rather than something you do. It was near the bar 20 minutes later that I heard the thing I did not understand the weight of until months afterward. A man I did not recognize, unsteady enough on his feet that I doubted he would remember saying it, was talking to another guest about funds and portfolios and the general unpleasantness of the current lending environment. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation he said Grant's name and the words, "tighter than anyone realizes." And I heard it, filed it away without meaning to, the way you file away any straight fact you have no immediate use for, and went back to my wine. I did not think about that sentence again for 5 months. I am only telling you now because it matters later, and because this is not the kind of story where I get to pretend I understood everything the moment it happened. I did not. I understood almost nothing that night, except the plain fact of my granddaughter's face when her father's hand turned her away from me, and the smaller, quieter fact of my daughter standing across the room in a green dress, watching the entire exchange happen and choosing in the space of about 4 seconds to look somewhere else instead. Josephine and I made eye contact exactly once that whole evening. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then she turned back toward the woman beside her, laughed at something that had apparently just been said, and did not look my way again for the rest of the night. I have thought about those 2 seconds more than I have thought about almost anything else from that entire year. Because I understood, watching her turn away, that I was going to have to figure out how to survive this family entirely on my own for a while. And that whatever came next, I could not count on my daughter to be the one who noticed it happening. By the time Josephine left my shop the next morning, carrying nothing back with her but half a cup of coffee and a question she never actually answered, I had decided to let my son-in-law believe I was losing my mind. I want to be clear that this was not a decision I made in anger. I have never once in 66 years made a good decision in anger, and I was not about to start with something this large. I made it the way I made every important decision in my working life, sitting still, turning the problem over slowly, waiting for the shape of the right answer to present itself. She came by around 8 before I had unlocked the front door for customers, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the place on Highland Avenue, and wearing the kind of determined expression I recognized from her childhood. The one she used to wear right before asking to stay up past her bedtime with an argument she had clearly rehearsed in the mirror first. "Dad," she said, setting 1 cup on my workbench, careful to avoid the loose parts. "I wanted to talk about last night." I told her the coffee was appreciated and asked what about last night needed talking about, though I already had a fair guess. She sat on the stool across from me, the one customers used when they wanted to watch me work instead of just dropping something off, and she took a long moment arranging her hands around her cup before she started. "Grant didn't mean anything by what he said," she told me. "That's just how he talks about things at those events. It's networking language. He does it about his own work too. You should hear how he describes his job to people he's trying to impress. It's all performance. None of it means what it sounds like it means." I did not point out that I had never once heard him describe his own work as something quaint that people did not do much of anymore. I let her keep talking, because I had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to understand what a person actually believes is to let them explain past the point where the explanation stops making sense. "I just think," she said, and here her voice dropped slightly, taking on the careful register she used when she was managing 2 different conversations inside one sentence, "that it would help everybody if you tried a little harder with him. Came to more things. Let him help with the business side of the shop since he's good at that kind of thing, and you've got enough on your plate just keeping up with the actual watches." "Help with the business side," I repeated back to her. And something in my voice must have carried more than I intended, because she set her cup down and looked at me directly for the first time since she had sat down. "You know what he actually offered, don't you?" I asked her. "Not vague help. He wants access to the accounts, to the building's title, to decisions about the shop that have never once in 3 generations belonged to anyone outside this family." "Did he tell you that part? Or only the part about how busy I am?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation I learned something I had not fully understood before that morning, which was that Grant had not told her the specifics either. He had given her the shape of a kindness, generic enough that she could carry it to me without ever having to examine what exactly she was carrying. "I'm not trying to gang up on you, Dad. I'm trying to keep this family from falling apart the same year we buried Mom. Do you understand how hard that's been, being the only bridge between the 2 of you? Every holiday, every dinner. I'm the one managing it, smoothing it, making sure nobody says the wrong thing. I can't keep doing that forever. I need you to meet him part way." I looked at my daughter for a long moment. Looked for Lorraine in her in the set of her jaw, the particular way she held still when she was working up to something difficult. I found traces. Not enough. "Are you asking me this for yourself?" I said. "Or are you asking it because Grant asked you to ask it?" She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "That's not fair," she said, which was not the same thing as an answer, and both of us understood that it was not, and neither of us said so out loud. I told her I would think about it. She left 20 minutes later, coffee half finished, and told me she loved me the way people say it when they are also underneath the words still a little bit angry at the same time, and I told her the same thing back, and meant it, and was also still a little bit angry, and I have found in my long life that both of those things can be true inside the same sentence without canceling each other out. I sat alone in the shop after she left, the untouched half of her coffee going cold on the counter. And I thought about the word she had used. Bridge. My daughter had cast herself as the structure holding two sides together, which meant, if I understood the architecture of it correctly, that she did not see herself as standing on either side at all. She saw herself as standing over the gap above both of us, managing the two of us the way you manage a job site with two crews who do not get along and never once ask why the disagreement started in the first place. I did not want to be managed. I especially did not want to be managed on Grant's behalf, dressed up in my daughter's voice, so that refusing him would mean refusing her instead. And somewhere in that hour of sitting alone with a cooling cup of coffee I had not asked for, an idea arrived that I did not choose so much as recognize, the way you recognize a tool you have been looking for that was sitting in plain sight the entire time on a shelf you had simply stopped checking. If I could not out-argue a man who controlled the conversation before it started, perhaps the answer was to stop being a man worth arguing with at all. Perhaps the safest place to stand for a while was somewhere Grant Farrow would never think to look for an opponent. Silas Trujillo has known me for 31 years, and in all that time I have heard him say maybe 4 sentences that turned out to matter more than he intended when he said them. The one he said to me on a Tuesday evening in early September, sitting on the stool across my workbench, with a bottle of decent bourbon he had brought under the excuse of a birthday I had already celebrated 2 weeks earlier, was the 4th. He showed up around 6 after I had flipped the sign to closed. But before I had actually locked the door, which was a distinction Silas understood without needing it explained, the way he understood most things about my habits after 3 decades of knowing me. He set the bottle on the counter, poured 2 fingers into the coffee mugs I kept for exactly this purpose, and sat without being invited, which was also fine because I had never once invited him to do anything in 31 years, and he had never once needed me to. Belated, he said, nodding at the bottle. Didn't feel right showing up empty-handed, 2 weeks late. I told him 2 weeks late was practically on time by his standards, and he allowed that this was fair, and we sat for a while, not talking about anything in particular, which is a skill Silas has that most people lack entirely, the ability to occupy a room comfortably without feeling obligated to fill it with words. He had spent 22 years with the Border Patrol before he retired to raise goats on 9 acres outside town, and something about that career leaves a man either talkative in a way that fills every silence with stories, or quiet in a way that lets silence do whatever work it needs to do. Silas had come out the quiet kind. "You seem off," he said eventually, turning his mug slowly on the counter without drinking from it. "Not sad exactly. Off. Like a gear that's meshing but not quite true." I told him it had been a hard year, which was true and also not the answer to what he was actually asking, and he knew it, and let it sit there for a moment before he tried again from a different angle, the way he used to describe working a scene where the first approach hadn't gotten him anywhere useful. "That thing at the gallery," he said. Josephine mentioned it in passing. Didn't make a thing of it. But I could hear it in how she wasn't making a thing of it. "And Grant's been handling paperwork for you, is that right?" "Some of it," I said. "Insurance mostly. Beneficiary forms." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You read all of it?" he asked. "Every page?" I told him the truth, which was that I had read most of it, and he nodded slowly, in the particular way he had that meant he was not going to say the obvious thing directly, because saying it directly would have felt like an accusation, and Silas did not make accusations without evidence. Instead, he told me something from his old work, a habit he had picked up interviewing people at the checkpoint for 2 decades, watching for the specific tell of someone hiding something small inside something large. "People don't usually lie to you with the things they say," he told me. "Most people are bad liars if you're only listening to their words. They lie with what they leave out, what they steer you away from looking at. You want to know if somebody's hiding something, don't watch their mouth. Watch where their hand goes when they think you're not paying attention." I thought about Grant's hand, the second folder, the way it had settled across the bottom 2/3 of that page, without ever technically covering anything, without ever once needing to be moved again. I did not say any of that out loud. I only told Silas I would take a closer look at the paperwork when I had a free evening, and he said that sounded reasonable, and poured us each another finger of bourbon and let the subject drop, the way a good friend knows how to let a subject drop before it becomes a demand. He left around 8. I locked the door behind him, turned off the front lights, and instead of going upstairs, I went to the drawer beneath the register, where I kept copies of anything I had signed in the last year. A habit Lorraine had drilled into me decades earlier, and one I had somehow, in 8 months of grief, let slip into a formality rather than a practice. The insurance document was near the bottom, exactly where I remembered filing it, and I sat down at the little desk Lorraine used to work from and read it properly for the first time since I had signed it start to finish under better light than a workbench crowded with gears ever offered. Most of it matched what Grant had told me. The coverage terms were ordinary. The numbers were reasonable. It was the date at the top of the second page that stopped me, a small thing, the kind of detail a man notices only because he has filled out the same kind of form 1,000 times over 40 years running a small business. And I had always, every single time, without exception, written my dates the way my father taught me to write them. Day before, month before, year. An old country habit he never let go of, and passed down to me before I was old enough to know it was unusual. This page had the American order. Month, then day, then year. Not my handwriting's habit. Not a mistake I have ever once made, not on a single form in my entire life. I sat with that fact for a long time, the desk lamp humming softly, the shop dark and quiet around me. It was a small thing. It was the kind of thing a reasonable man could explain away in a dozen ordinary ways. A photocopy error, a second draft I had simply forgotten signing, a coincidence not worth the weight I was giving it. But I have spent my whole life reading small inconsistencies in machines that were trying very hard not to show me anything was wrong, and I recognized the feeling of finding one immediately. The particular unsettled sensation of a page that looked correct and was not. I did not call Renata that night. I did not call anyone. I put the document back in the drawer exactly where I had found it, turned off the lamp, and sat alone in the dark shop for a while longer than I usually allowed myself to sit still. Because Silas's sentence had settled into the same part of my mind where the drunk man's sentence at the gallery had already been sitting for weeks. Two facts with no visible relationship to each other except the growing wordless certainty that something underneath my own life had quietly stopped matching what I had been told it was. The first time I let a customer watch me forget something, my hands were shaking so badly from the effort of faking it convincingly that I nearly forgot something for real. And I have never told anyone, not even Renata, how close that morning came to going wrong. For reasons that had nothing to do with my plan. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Silas brought the bourbon and Mrs. Delacroix Whitfield had come in with her late husband's railroad watch, a piece I had serviced for her twice before, and could have opened blindfolded. I set my loop on the bench the way I always did, reached for it a moment later, and let it slip off the edge of the workbench onto the concrete floor, where the eyepiece cracked clean across. There is a particular discipline required to break something on purpose and make it look like an accident. One I had never once needed in 40 years of handling delicate instruments with genuine care. I had practiced the motion twice alone the night before, timing exactly how much surprise to let show on my face, exactly how long to let the silence stretch before I reacted. Even so, watching the loop actually shatter on the concrete, hearing that small, precise crack, something in my chest tightened that had nothing to do with performance at all. I am so sorry, I told her, staring at the loop as though I could not entirely account for how it had gotten there. I don't know where my head's been lately. She was kind about it, the way people are kind to a man they have known for years and have started, without quite admitting it to themselves yet, to worry about. She asked if I was feeling all right. I told her I had not been sleeping well, which was true, though not for the reasons she assumed, and she left the watch with me and told me to take my time, no rush at all, Wendell. And the particular gentleness in how she said my name told me the performance had already started working, before I had even decided how far I intended to take it. I broke 3 more loops that month. I misplaced a customer's ticket twice, both times in front of witnesses, both times found within the hour in a drawer where it had no business being. I called a man named Coburn by his brother's name at the counter one Thursday afternoon, a mistake I made on purpose, and then apologized for so thoroughly that the apology itself became the memorable part of the exchange, not the error. Josephine noticed within 2 weeks. She would have noticed sooner if she had been watching more closely, but I had built the pattern gradually enough that no single event seemed worth a phone call on its own, only the accumulation of them, which is exactly how I had designed it. She called on a Sunday evening, her voice carrying the particular strain of someone who has been rehearsing a difficult conversation in the car on the way home from somewhere. "Dad," she said, "Mrs. Whitfield mentioned you dropped a loop last month, and Mr. Alvarado's wife said you called him George twice in one visit. Is everything okay? Are you eating enough, sleeping enough?" I told her I was tired, that grief did strange things to a person's concentration, that I would try to be more careful, and every word of that was in its own way true, even though none of it was the actual explanation. And I have thought since about how a man can tell his daughter nothing but true sentences and still be lying to her completely, simply by choosing which true sentences to say out loud. She called Grant that same night. I know this because I was standing close enough to the phone in my own kitchen 3 weeks later, when Josephine mentioned it in passing, that I understood the call had happened and roughly what had been said in it, though I never heard the conversation directly, only its aftermath in the careful new gentleness Grant began extending toward me at the rare family dinners I still attended. "I think we should talk to someone," Grant told Josephine, according to what she later repeated to me, meaning it kindly. Meaning it in the specific tone of a man laying groundwork he has been waiting a long time for an excuse to lay. Not right away, but if it keeps happening. There are people who specialize in this. There's no shame in it. I have imagined that phone call more times than is probably useful for a man my age to imagine anything. I imagined Grant's face while he said it, whether there was any flicker underneath the concern, any small satisfaction he could not quite keep off his features, even alone in his own study, with no one watching him say the words. I will never know for certain. I only know that within the month Grant had begun asking Josephine gently, regularly, whether I seemed like myself, and that every time she reported back that I seemed a little worse, something in the timeline of his own plans appeared, from what I later learned, to accelerate. He called me directly once that same week, using the concerned voice I would come to recognize over the following months, the way you recognize a familiar tool by its weight before you have even looked at it. "Dad," he said, "how are you feeling, really? Josephine mentioned some trouble at the shop. I want you to know I'm here if you need anything handled, anything at all. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself." I thanked him. I told him I appreciated it, that I was managing fine, that the loop had simply been old and prone to slipping. He said, of course, no need to explain yourself to me." And something in the careful patience of that sentence told me exactly how thoroughly he had already decided not to believe a word of my explanation, and how content he was to let that disbelief sit quietly, unspoken, gathering weight. That night, after Josephine's call, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a plain composition notebook I had bought at the drugstore on Highland Avenue for exactly this purpose. And I wrote down in careful and complete detail everything I had actually forgotten and everything I had only pretended to forget, so that I would never once, not for a single day of whatever came next, lose track of the difference between the two. I hid that notebook inside the housing of an old mantel clock I kept on a shelf above my workbench, a piece so far past economical repair that no customer had asked about it in 15 years, its movement long since removed and never replaced. Nobody opens a clock that does not run. That was the entire logic of the hiding place. The same logic, though, I did not know it yet, that my wife had trusted 18 months earlier when she chose 4 working watches instead of 1 dead one, because she had understood something about me that I was only now beginning to understand about myself. The safest place to keep a truth is inside a thing everyone has already decided has nothing left worth looking for. I found my wife's handwriting 18 months after I buried her, folded into eighths and wedged behind the balance wheel of a watch that had nothing to do with either of us. And for nearly a full minute, I could not make myself believe what I was looking at. It rained that afternoon, which, in Marfa, happens perhaps 11 times a year, and always changes the particular quality of light coming through the shop's front window, gray and soft, instead of the usual hard desert white. I had closed early, no customers likely with weather like that, keeping tourists off Highland Avenue, and I sat at my bench with nothing scheduled, and no real reason to keep working. Except that idle hands, in my experience, invite exactly the kind of thinking a man is better off avoiding. There was a corner of the bench I had not touched in 18 months. 4 watches customer pieces left mid-repair on the morning Lorraine died, each one still sitting in the exact tray I had set it in that Tuesday undisturbed, because I had simply never been able to make myself return to that particular section of unfinished work. I had told myself over the intervening months a number of practical reasons for the avoidance. The customers had stopped calling. The parts I needed were probably obsolete by now. It would be easier to start fresh than to remember where I had left off. None of that was true. The truth was simpler and less flattering. That corner of the bench was the last place I had been an ordinary man on an ordinary morning, and some part of me had decided, without ever saying so out loud, that leaving it untouched was a way of leaving that morning untouched too. As though the watches themselves were evidence I was not yet ready to disturb. I picked up the first one that rainy afternoon. A lady's Elgin, with a cracked mainspring, mostly because it was closest to hand, and because performing forgetfulness had ironically made me start actually looking busy at things I had been avoiding for real. I opened the case back, and there, tucked against the movement in a space no watch part had any business occupying, was a small square of paper folded into eighths, the creases soft and old, the way paper gets when it has been folded and unfolded or simply left folded for a very long time. I did not recognize it as anything significant at first. I assumed, reaching for it with tweezers, that it was some scrap I had left there myself, a note to remind me of a part number, a customer's callback time, something ordinary. I unfolded it on the bench under the good lamp, and I saw my wife's handwriting, small and precise. The same hand that had filled 41 years of ledgers, and my own hands went still on the bench in a way they had not gone still in 18 months. It was not a letter. That was the first thing I understood looking at it, and somehow the disappointment of that fact arrived before anything else did. An old man's foolish hope for one more sentence of love from a woman who had run out of time to write one. What I was looking at instead was a column of figures, 3 dates in June of the previous year, each paired with a dollar amount, and beside the third figure, underlined twice in a way Lorraine only ever underlined things she considered urgent, a single word. Meridian. I did not know what meridian meant. I turned the paper over looking for more and found nothing on the reverse side, only the figures and the underlined word, and at the very bottom in smaller writing, a note that was not a full sentence so much as a fragment left mid-thought. Ask G where the difference went. My hands were not steady when I set that paper down on the bench beside the open watch case. I sat with it for a long moment, the rain still coming down outside the shop quiet, except for the ordinary tick of the working clocks around me. And I understood with the particular clarity that arrives sometimes when something you have half known becomes something you fully know, that this had not been the only watch on that bench, and that whatever Lorraine had been trying to tell me, she had not trusted herself to say it only once. I thought of the habit she had described to me 100 times over the years, without my ever fully appreciating it. The careful cross-checking of every deposit against her own paper ledger. The 2 bank errors she had caught and been so quietly proud of catching. Numbers do not lie, she used to say. But the people who type them in sometimes do. I had heard that sentence so many times it had become background noise, the kind of thing a spouse says often enough that it stops registering as information and starts registering only as a familiar sound. I understood now, sitting alone in the rain-gray shop, that it had never been background noise at all. It had been a warning she gave me for years, plainly in the open, and I had simply never once thought to ask her what she was warning me about. The word meridian meant nothing to me. I turned it over in my mind the way I would turn over an unfamiliar part, looking for what it might connect to, and found only blank space where an answer should have been. G could have meant a dozen things, It could have meant nothing at all, an abbreviation for some vendor or account I had never known the name of. But I had been alive long enough and married long enough to know that Lorraine Ashcroft did not underline things twice by accident, and she did not leave a sentence unfinished on paper unless she had planned somewhere down the line to finish it herself in person when the moment was right. She had never gotten that moment. That thought sat in my chest with a weight I did not have a place to put down. And I understood, looking at the 3 remaining watches still waiting in that tray, that whatever she had wanted to tell me, she had trusted the telling to outlast her folded into machines that only I would ever think to open. I reached for the second watch waiting in that same tray, with hands that were by then shaking badly enough that I had to set it down twice before I could open the case back cleanly. The second watch held a note with 2 more figures and the same underlined word, meridian, followed by a partial account number I did not recognize. 6 digits trailing off where the paper had worn thin at the fold. Beneath the numbers, a single sentence in handwriting pressed harder into the page than the first note had been. This is not a bookkeeping error. Someone is moving money and calling it something else. The third watch held nothing at all. I opened the case back carefully the way I had opened the first 2 and found only the ordinary movement undisturbed, no paper wedged anywhere against the gears, no trace that she had ever touched this particular piece at all. I sat with that empty case open in my palm for a long moment, feeling something close to grief again, fresh and specific, an absurd and entirely irrational disappointment that she had not managed to leave something in every single hiding place she had available to her before I made myself set it aside and pick up the fourth. The fourth watch was a gentleman's Hamilton, a railroad piece belonging to a rancher 2 counties over, who had never called to ask about it. And inside, folded into the same careful eighths as the others, was the longest of the 4 notes. 4 lines instead of 2, written in a hand that had grown slightly less steady than the others, as though this one had come last, written closest to the end, when her strength for careful penmanship was already beginning to fail her. Meridian Creative Holdings, it read, the letters pressed firmly into the page. G's Fund. 3 transfers from the shop's operating account routed through it since March, each one dressed up as equipment financing. I asked him about it at dinner in April. He laughed and called me paranoid. I am not paranoid. I am careful, and careful women get called paranoid by men who have something to hide. Below that, in the smaller, more urgent handwriting, I recognized from the first note one final line, the one I have since read more times than any other sentence in my life. If you are reading this, and I am not there to explain it myself, do not trust the paperwork he brings you. Read everything twice. I am sorry I did not tell you sooner. I kept waiting for proof instead of trusting my own eyes, and I ran out of time to be right. I set the paper down on the bench. I did not cry, not at first, which surprised me even as it was happening. What came out of me instead was a single short laugh. Sharp and involuntary, the kind of sound a body makes when it has been asked to hold too much at once and finds absurdly that laughter is the fastest valve available, the only opening wide enough for that much pressure to escape through at once. It lasted less than a second, then it was gone, and what replaced it arrived all at once, with no warning left to soften it, no gradual build I could brace myself against, the way I might brace for a familiar kind of pain. I do not remember standing up from the stool. I remember the rain against the window, steadier now than an hour earlier, and the ordinary tick of the working clocks around me continuing exactly as they always did, indifferent patient, the way machines are patient with anything a person needs to feel in front of them. I remember the smell of machine oil and old wood that had filled that shop for 3 generations unchanged, while everything else in the room had just become unrecognizable. I stood at the window a long time and did not turn the lights on. Somewhere down the street, a truck downshifted at the stop sign, the sound carrying further than it should have in the wet air, and then it was gone, and the shop was quiet again, except for the clocks. I made myself remember the dinner she had described, and it came back slowly, the way a room comes back into focus after your eyes adjust to darkness. April at Josephine and Grant's table, ordinary conversation about the shop's spring inventory, drifting into a question about equipment financing Grant had mentioned setting up. Lorraine had asked a pointed question about the routing of it. Grant had laughed, an easy, warm sound, said something about his mother-in-law keeping him honest. And the table had laughed with him, myself included. And the subject had closed itself without my ever once noticing it needed to stay open. When I could speak again, if only to myself, the first thing I understood clearly was this. Lorraine had suspected something for at least 4 months before she died, had gathered figures, had confronted Grant directly at a family dinner. I remembered attending, and remembered nothing unusual about, because he had laughed it off so smoothly that even I, sitting 3 feet away, had noticed nothing wrong. She had not been paranoid, she had been exactly right, and had run out of time to be believed for it, and had spent some of her last working weeks hiding the proof inside 4 watches instead of trusting anyone still living to carry it forward for her. I felt standing there 2 things at once that did not cancel each other out the same way gratitude and grief had refused to cancel each other out at her funeral. I was grateful fiercely that she had trusted me enough to leave this rather than simply letting it die with her. And underneath that gratitude, quieter but no less real, sat something closer to shame. The specific shame of a man realizing his wife had tried at least once, in a dinner conversation he barely remembered, to warn him directly, and he had let a laugh and a practiced denial be enough to close the subject. I am not the kind of man who apologizes to the dead out loud. I did it anyway, quietly, standing at that window, with the rain still falling outside. And then I did the only other thing that felt like it belonged in that moment, which was to go back to the bench, gather all 4 notes into a single stack, and read them through one more time, start to finish, until I had every word of them by memory, well enough that no one could ever again take them from me, the way Grant had taken so much else without my noticing. By the time I finally turned the shop lights back on, well past what should have been my supper hour, something in me had shifted from grieving what Lorraine had known to deciding what I intended to do about it. Whatever came next, I was no longer only a man performing forgetfulness to buy himself time. I was a man who finally had something worth the performance protecting, and a wife's steady hand reaching across 18 months of silence, showing him exactly where to start looking. I woke Silas Trujillo at 11:40 that night by knocking on his kitchen door instead of calling first. A decision that would have alarmed a less steady man, and Silas only pulled on a shirt. Put coffee on without asking why and told me to sit down before I said a single word about what had brought me out to his 9 acres in the dark. His kitchen smelled like wood smoke, and the particular mineral dust that clings to everything on a working goat operation, no matter how carefully a man scrubs his hands before coming inside. A corkboard by the back door held photographs going back decades, some of them faded nearly to nothing. His years at the checkpoint, mixed in among pictures of 9 acres, slowly turned from scrubland into something that fed a family. He set 2 mugs on the table, sat across from me, the way he always sat, and waited. Because Silas had spent 22 years learning that a person who drives to your house at midnight will tell you what happened in their own time, and pushing them only slows it down. I put the 4 folded notes on his table in the order I had found them and told him where they had come from and how long they had been sitting there unopened while I built a shop full of ordinary Tuesdays around a corner of the bench I had simply refused to touch. I watched something in his face change as he read, not surprise exactly, more the particular stillness of a man confirming a suspicion he had been carrying quietly for longer than he had let on, the kind of stillness I remembered from 31 years of watching him take in bad news without ever once raising his voice about it. "Meridian," he said when he finished the last one, tapping the underlined word with one thick finger. "I've heard that name." "Where did you hear that?" I asked him. He was quiet for a moment, turning his mug slowly, the way he did when he was reaching back through memory for something specific rather than general. "My nephew does freelance web work down in Alpine," he said finally. "Built a site for some small investment fund out of Santa Fe, about 2 years back. Before I ever knew you had a son-in-law in that line of work, he mentioned the name once in passing, complained the client was slow to pay." Meridian Creative Holdings. I remember because I thought it was a strange name for a money outfit. Sounded more like something that sold picture frames. "That's Grant's fund," I said quietly. or connected to it somehow. I don't know the full structure of it yet. Silas set his mug down carefully, the way you set something down when you want the sound of it to punctuate a sentence rather than interrupt one. "Wendell," he said, using the plain, direct tone he reserved for the moments that mattered most, "this isn't a family disagreement anymore. If your wife documented money moving out of your business account into an outside fund and she called it what it looks like, she called it, that's not a conversation for a Sunday dinner. That's a matter for somebody with a law degree." "I know," I said. "You called me instead of calling Josephine," he said. "That's telling. And you didn't call the police either, which tells me something too. What are you actually planning to do with this?" I thought about that question longer than I had thought about almost anything since the shop had gone dark that evening. I told him the truth, which was that I did not entirely know yet, only that I understood two things clearly. I was not ready to hand this to Josephine before I understood the whole shape of it myself, because she loved her husband and would need more than four-folded notes to believe what those notes were telling her, notes she had never seen written in a hand she would recognize instantly, and would want more than anything to find some innocent explanation for. And I was not ready to confront Grant directly either, because a man who had already learned to hide a document under another document was not a man who would simply confess when caught. He would only learn what I knew and adjust accordingly, faster and more carefully than I could adjust in return. "So what's the plan?" Silas said again, and there was no impatience in it, only the steady patience of a man used to sitting with someone until they arrived at their own answer, instead of being handed one. "I need someone who can tell me what this actually is under the law," I said. "Fraud, theft, something else entirely. Someone who won't repeat a word of it to Grant, to Josephine, to anyone, until I decide it's time." "Renata Osei," Silas said, almost before I had finished the sentence. "Handled a boundary dispute for my cousin's ranch 4 years back, settled it clean without ever going to trial. Property law mostly, but she'll know who to bring in if this needs a specialist. Or she'll be sharp enough to handle it herself. Small office on Highland above the insurance place. I can call her office in the morning, tell her a friend of mine needs a confidential consultation, urgent." I told him I would appreciate that. He nodded, refilled both our mugs without asking, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The kitchen quiet except for the tick of a wall clock I had serviced for him myself years earlier. A plain thing with a slightly loud movement he had never once complained about. Before I left that night, standing at his door with the cold coming in around us, Silas asked me one more question. The one I have thought about more than almost anything else he has ever said to me. "What are you going to do about the part where you've been lying to your own daughter for weeks, pretending to lose your mind?" he asked. "Because that's not going to stay separate from this much longer. Not once a lawyer's involved." I did not have an answer for him that night. I told him I would figure it out when I had to, and he looked at me for a long moment in the porch light, the particular look of an old friend deciding whether to push further or let a man carry his own weight a while longer. And then he told me to drive careful on the way home. The roads got icy out past the county line this time of year. And I told him I would, and I did, and I thought about his question the entire way back to Elm Street in the dark, turning it over the way I had turned over the definition of the word protected months earlier, and finding again that I did not yet have an answer good enough to say out loud to anyone, least of all myself. Renata Osei's office sat above the insurance agency on Highland Avenue, up a narrow staircase that smelled faintly of the dry cleaner 2 doors down. A single room with a window air conditioner and a desk that looked like it had survived at least 2 previous tenants. The first thing she asked me before I had even finished sitting down in the chair across from her desk was whether my daughter might have known about any of this. I told her no immediately, with more force in my voice than I had intended, my hand coming down flat on the arm of the chair, hard enough that the sound of it filled the small room. "Josephine has nothing to do with this," I said. "She loves that man. She wouldn't have helped him do this to me, and I won't sit here and let anyone build a case that suggests otherwise, not even you. Not even to be thorough." Renata did not flinch or apologize for asking, only watched me for a moment with the particular stillness of a person accustomed to strong reactions and unbothered by them. Mr. Ashcroft, she said, I have to ask these questions in a certain order, whether or not you like the order. Your daughter's name is on several documents connected to this property and this business. If we're going to build anything solid, I need to be able to say with confidence that she had no knowledge of what her husband was doing. Right now, I can't say that. I can only say that you believe it, and belief is not the same standard a judge will hold me to. I told her I did not just believe it, I knew it. 40 years of watching that girl grow up gave me the right to know it. And Renata nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they have heard the same certainty from 100 other clients, and understand it is usually sincere and occasionally wrong, and that her job requires her to plan for both possibilities at once, regardless of which one it turns out to be. Consider it asked and answered for now, she said, opening a legal pad and clicking a pen. I won't raise it again unless something in the record makes me have to. Show me what you brought. I set the 4 folded notes on her desk, along with the insurance document from the drawer beneath my register, and Renata read through all of it twice in complete silence. The kind of silence that told me she was working, rather than simply reading. Cross-referencing dates against dates, checking figures against figures in a way I would not have known to check them myself. A yellow highlighter uncapped and forgotten in her hand, for the better part of 10 minutes. This date, she said, finally tapping the second page of the insurance document with one finger. You said you noticed the format was wrong. I told her about the habit my father had taught me day before month before year, and how I had never once in 40 years of paperwork written a date any other way, and how this page had the American order instead, month before day, a detail so small I had almost talked myself out of trusting it in the weeks since I first noticed. That's not nothing, Renata said. That's actually significant. More significant than most clients realize when they bring me something like this. If this page was substituted after your original signature page, using a template formatted differently than whatever you initially reviewed, that's consistent with a document being altered post-execution, which is a very different legal problem than an insurance form you simply misunderstood or signed carelessly. It would mean the page in front of you today, the one your son-in-law filed, isn't the page you actually agreed to that Thursday afternoon. She set the document down and looked at me directly. Here is what I think happened based on what you've brought me. And I want to be clear, this is an early theory, not a finished picture. I think your son-in-law had you sign something narrower than what currently exists in whatever file he's kept, likely a personal guarantee tied to some financing arrangement, using your shop and possibly this building as collateral. I think your wife discovered irregular transfers moving through a fund connected to him, and began documenting them before she passed, and I think she died before she had enough to act on it with the confidence she needed. That matches what I understand, I said. If that's accurate, Renata said, then you are sitting on something considerably larger than a family disagreement. Depending on how the collateral language is written, you may be looking at fraud, in the inducement forged or altered instruments, and potentially misappropriation of business funds, which starts moving from civil matters into criminal ones very quickly. The next step is straightforward, if not fast. I file a records request for the LLC filings connected to Meridian Creative Holdings, and I have someone I trust examine the insurance document itself. The paper, the ink, whether the second page was printed on the same equipment as the first, that kind of forensic detail holds up far better in front of a judge than a man's memory of his own handwriting habits, however reliable that memory happens to be. But Mr. Ashcroft, I want to say one more thing to you. Plainly, because I think you need to hear it stated out loud, rather than left implied. I waited. You've been telling people you're losing your memory, she said. Deliberately, according to what Silas explained to me on the phone before you arrived. I understand the strategic logic of it, buying yourself time to investigate, without alerting the person you suspect before you have anything solid enough to move on. But you should understand plainly what that strategy costs you, if this ever reaches a courtroom. A man who has spent months convincing his own family he may be incompetent is a man whose son-in-law now has a paper trail of witnesses ready to say exactly that under oath, and you will have built that paper trail for him yourself, one dropped loop at a time, one confused customer interaction at a time, all of it perfectly documented by people who love you and were only trying to help. I had not thought of it in exactly those terms before. I told her so quietly, and something in my chest went cold hearing it laid out that plainly, in a voice that had no interest in softening it for my sake. "Think of it that way from now on," she said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. "You're not just racing to gather evidence before Grant moves against you. You're racing against your own performance, which is getting more convincing every week, whether you intend it to or not. The longer this takes, the harder it becomes for anyone, including me, to prove after the fact that you were ever pretending at all." Renata called me on a Thursday morning in early November, her voice carrying an urgency I had not heard from her in the 6 weeks since I hired her. And the first thing she told me was that an anonymous email had arrived in her office inbox overnight, sent from an account with no name attached, containing 11 attachments and a single line of text. "You should see what he's actually done to this family." I drove to her office within the hour, faster than I probably should have, on the roads out past the county line, and found her already at her desk with the printer still warm, the stack nearly as thick as the folder Grant would eventually bring to a courtroom months later. She walked me through it, page by page, the way she had walked me through the insurance document weeks earlier. Methodical, unhurried, unwilling to let me draw a conclusion before the evidence had actually earned it, though I could tell, even in her careful pacing, that something in this stack had unsettled even her. The sender's name was not on anything. No signature, no return address. That led anywhere real. But by the third page, Renata and I had both independently guessed who it was. A young woman named Priscilla Nakamura, listed on an internal organizational chart as operations coordinator for Meridian Creative Holdings. The same title appearing on 2 of the emails included in the packet. Emails between Grant and his own attorney, discussing what the subject line called liquidity concerns. The concerns were not abstract. Grant had taken out a personal loan 18 months earlier, structured through a private lender in Santa Fe, using assets he did not fully own as collateral. A phrase I read 3 times before I understood it was describing my shop. And my building, pledged without my knowledge, my name never once appearing anywhere on the loan documents. Despite everything, the loan was actually secured against. Beneath that, in smaller print in one of the loan schedules, a specific line item that made my hands go still on Renata's desk, the way they had gone still over Lorraine's notes weeks earlier. 1 heirloom timepiece, appraised value included in collateral calculation pending physical verification. That was the watch, I said, my voice coming out flatter than I had expected. My grandfather's watch. He used it to secure a loan he never intends to pay off with anything of his own. A watch that has sat in that shop's front case for 60 years, and never once belonged to anyone but this family. Renata nodded, not looking up from the page, letting me have the moment without rushing past it. "The loan matures in 90 days, she said. "Balloon payment, the kind of structure a lender uses when they expect the borrower to refinance before it comes due, rather than pay the full amount at once. Based on what's in here, Grant does not currently have the capacity to refinance or repay it. His fund has taken losses on at least 2 projects this year that these emails reference directly, and his personal accounts, from what Priscilla appears to have pulled together, are not carrying anywhere near enough to cover the shortfall." I sat with that fact for a long moment, and something surfaced in my memory that I had not thought about in over 2 months. A stray sentence overheard near a bar at an art gallery in October. A man unsteady on his feet, complaining to another guest about the current lending environment, saying Grant's name and the words, "tighter than anyone realizes," before I had gone back to my wine without a second thought. I told Renata about it, and she wrote it down without comment, filing it into whatever larger shape she was building of a man running out of ways to cover what he had already spent, a man whose troubles had apparently been visible to strangers at a wine table a full month before I ever thought to take them seriously myself. "That confirms the timeline, rather than changing it," she said. "He's been under this pressure longer than either of us initially assumed, which tells us something important. Whatever he decides to do about it, he's going to need to do it soon, and he's going to need it to look legitimate when he does." I asked her what she meant by that exactly, and she set the papers down and looked at me the way she had looked at me during our first meeting. Direct, unhurried, entirely without softening. A man in Grant's position has two paths left, she said. He either finds new capital fast enough to refinance before the balloon payment comes due, which, based on what I'm reading here, looks increasingly unlikely, given how thin his accounts appear to be. Or he finds a way to gain legal control over assets he can leverage without your cooperation. Assets that would suddenly become available if a court decided you were no longer capable of managing them yourself. Given what you've already told me about the performance you've been running, Mr. Ashcroft, I don't think it takes much imagination to guess which direction this is heading, and I don't think we have as much time to prepare for it as either of us would like. She picked up the phone on her desk before I had fully absorbed what she had said, already dialing her finger, moving down the number with the practiced speed of someone who had made this exact call more times than she probably wanted to admit. She told me while it rang that I needed to hear the rest of this directly from her rather than secondhand, because whatever Grant decided to do next, I needed to know it before he had any reason to suspect that I already did, and there was no version of that conversation that could safely wait for a scheduled appointment. You need to understand something else about how these next few weeks are likely to go, she said, cupping her hand briefly over the receiver while the line continued ringing. Once someone in Grant's position decides to move, they tend to move quickly and all at once, because hesitation gives the other side time to prepare, and a man in his line of work understands leverage well enough to know that speed is its own kind of protection. If he's going to file anything against you, it will likely come sooner than either of us would prefer, dressed up in language that sounds entirely reasonable to anyone reading it for the first time, without the context we have. I asked her what I should be doing in the meantime, and she told me simply to keep doing exactly what I had been doing to keep the performance running smoothly enough that Grant felt no particular urgency to accelerate his own timeline. Though she said it with a weight in her voice that told me she understood exactly how much that instruction was going to cost me before this was over. Renata called again that same evening just after 7 while I was closing out the register for the night, alone the shop, empty for over an hour already, and this time her voice had lost the urgency of the morning call entirely, replaced by something quieter and more careful, the tone of a person delivering news they have been dreading having to deliver. News she had clearly been rehearsing how to say correctly on the drive back to her office. He filed this afternoon, she said. Petition for a court-ordered conservatorship, Presidio County. I just got the notice from the clerk's office an hour ago, and I wanted you to hear it from me directly, in full, before it reached you any other way. From a neighbor, from Josephine, from anyone less careful with the facts of it than I intend to be. I set the register drawer down on the counter without closing it, the coin still loose inside, and asked her what exactly that meant, though some part of me had already understood the shape of it before she finished explaining. The way you understand the shape of a diagnosis before the doctor finishes the sentence. It means he's asking the court to declare you incapacitated, she said, and to appoint himself as your legal guardian with authority over your finances, your business decisions, and any major choices about your care and living arrangements going forward, effectively removing your legal right to make decisions about your own life without his sign-off. He's citing a pattern of memory lapses reported by multiple witnesses, including your daughter, and he's requesting an expedited hearing given what the petition describes as your advancing age, and I'm quoting directly here. The risk of further financial harm to yourself if left unsupervised. I did not say anything for a long moment. Outside the shop window, Highland Avenue was empty in the particular way small towns go empty after dark in November. One truck idling at the stop sign 2 blocks down, its headlights catching the mist coming off the desert. Cold settling in for the night. I could hear the wall clock behind me, the ordinary tick of it, steady and indifferent, the same sound it had made every evening of the 18 months since Lorraine died, unbothered by anything happening in the room around it. I stood there for perhaps 30 seconds without speaking, my hand still resting on the open register drawer, listening to that clock and to the quiet hiss of the space heater under the counter, and to nothing else at all. Because there was nothing else in that moment that seemed worth listening to. And because some part of me needed those 30 seconds of ordinary sound, the small, unremarkable machinery of an unremarkable evening, before I could make myself say anything in response to what I had just been told. A moth circled the desk lamp once, twice, 3 times, and finally settled on the shade, wings folding still. And I watched it settle there, the way you watch anything at all when your mind has temporarily run out of room for the thing it is actually supposed to be thinking about. "When did he file this?" I finally asked her. "This afternoon," she repeated. 2:15 exactly according to the clerk's timestamp. Which means he moved the same week Priscilla's documents reached us, possibly the same day, possibly within hours of each other, though there's no way for us to know that for certain yet. I don't think that's a coincidence, Mr. Ashcroft. I think Priscilla wasn't the only person watching his finances closely enough to notice something was accelerating, and I think Grant knew on some level that his window for acting quietly was closing. I asked her when the hearing would be. 3 weeks, she said again. The judge granted his request for expedited scheduling given the medical concerns cited in the petition. That's faster than these things usually move, considerably faster, which tells me his attorney built a strong enough paper trail of witnessed incidents to convince the judge this couldn't wait for the normal docket weeks or sometimes months out under ordinary circumstances. A paper trail I built for him myself. With my own 2 hands, I said, more to myself than to her, and the sentence sat there in the quiet shop like something I had dropped and could not pick back up. Renata did not correct me, which told me more than any reassurance could have. 3 weeks, she said, again instead. That's what we have to work with. I need everything, Mr. Ashcroft, everything you have and everything I can gather in that window, because right now, on paper, his case looks considerably stronger than yours does, and I do not say that to frighten you, only because you deserve to hear exactly where we stand rather than a version softened for your comfort. "Do we have enough time?" I asked her at last, and I heard in my own voice a thinness I did not recognize. The particular sound of a man asking a question he already half suspects he will not like the answer to. She was quiet on the other end of the line for a moment. The kind of pause I had come to recognize in her over these past weeks, the pause of a person choosing to answer honestly, rather than comfortably weighing exactly how much weight I could carry in a single phone call, versus how much needed to wait until I was sitting across from her in person. "Not if we only work with what we currently have," she said. "Not enough to counter a pattern of witness decline that you spent months carefully constructing yourself, incident by incident, in front of people who genuinely believed what they were seeing and will testify to that belief with complete sincerity, which makes them far more persuasive than any witness who was simply lying. We need something more direct than notes hidden in watches and an anonymous email from a woman who might get cold feet before she'll agree to testify under her own name. We need proof that connects him directly to altering that document, something concrete enough that he can't explain it away as a misunderstanding or a clerical error. And right now, 3 weeks out, I don't have it yet." I stood in the dark shop after we hung up the phone, still warm in my hand. The register still open, the coins still loose and uncounted. The wall clock still ticking behind me with the same patient indifference it had kept up all evening. And I understood, for the first time since this had all started back in September, that the performance I had built to protect myself had a clock of its own now running underneath it. One I had never set and could not stop, counting down toward a courtroom where the only man in the room who fully understood exactly how convincing I had made myself was the one man determined to use every bit of that against me. I did not witness what happened in Grant and Josephine's home office on the second Tuesday of that 3-week window. I learned it 4 days later sitting across from my daughter at Renata's office, and I have gone over her account of it in my mind so many times since that it has become in a way as much mine as it is hers, worn smooth in my memory the way a story gets worn smooth from being turned over too many times. Josephine had spent the evening gathering what Grant's attorney called supporting materials, photographs, calendar entries, anything that might help build the picture the petition needed of a devoted daughter, genuinely concerned for her father's well-being. She told me later she had done it without much thought, the way you do a task assigned to you by someone you trust completely. Filing folders and printing emails at the desk in the small office off their kitchen, while Grant traveled for a client meeting in Houston, expected back the following evening. The desk had 2 drawers she rarely opened, both technically shared space, both mostly filled with Grant's older files from before they were married. Tax returns and old lease agreements, and the kind of paperwork a person keeps without ever expecting to need again. She was looking for a specific photograph, one taken at a birthday dinner the previous spring that she thought might help illustrate the timeline the attorney wanted. And she pulled the lower drawer open without particular attention, the way you open a drawer you have opened 100 times before without incident. The folder was near the back, unlabeled, slightly thicker than the others sitting around it. She told me she almost did not open it at all, that some ordinary domestic instinct nearly closed that drawer and moved her on to the next one. And she has wondered since, out loud to me more than once, what would have happened if that instinct had won. Inside was a copy of the insurance document. Not the version I had signed, or rather the version I remembered signing. The top portion I had actually read that Thursday afternoon on my own workbench. This was the complete version, unobstructed, every line visible, including an entire section that had never once appeared in my own copy language, about a personal guarantee about my shop and my building serving as collateral for an outside loan. Language that made no reference whatsoever to insurance of any kind, not equipment replacement value, not business interruption coverage, none of it. She read it standing at the desk, she told me, still in her coat, because she had only just come home from work. And she read it a second time, sitting down, because the first reading had not felt real enough to trust. She recognized my signature at the bottom of the page, the same signature she had watched me sign 1,000 documents with over the course of her whole life. The same crooked slant to the J that had been there since a framing accident in 1994. And she understood, within the space of perhaps 3 minutes, exactly what she was looking at, and exactly what it meant about the man she had married. What followed that recognition, she told me, was not the immediate horror she might have expected of herself. It was quieter than that, and slower. She set the page down on the desk. She sat very still in the office chair, her coat still buttoned, her keys still in her other hand, where she had set them down without thinking when she first sat to search the drawer. The apartment around her held the particular silence of a space with only one person breathing in it, the refrigerator humming faintly from the kitchen. A car passing somewhere below on the street. Ordinary sounds, continuing exactly as they always did, while everything else had just stopped, making sense. She did not reach for her phone. She did not call out, though there was no one to call out to. She simply sat, hands flat on her knees, and let the quiet do whatever work quiet does in a moment like that one. She did not call anyone right away. She told me this part, carefully watching my face as she said it, as though she needed to know I understood the difference between what she did next and what a person in a television drama might have done. Some immediate dramatic gesture, some confrontation staged for effect. She did not call Grant. She did not call me. She sat at that desk for a long while, the folder open in front of her, working her way slowly toward whatever came next, because crying felt like something that belonged to a later part of whatever this was, a part she had not reached, a door she had not yet decided to walk through. What she did eventually, once whatever had needed to settle in her had finished settling, was take out her phone and photograph every page of that folder, front and back, in careful order, working methodically the way you work when your hands need a task to occupy them while the rest of you is still catching up to what has happened, still trying to fit this new fact into the shape of the life she had believed she was living an hour earlier. She told me later it was the same instinct for documentation that must have come to her from a mother she had watched cross-check bank statements at the kitchen table her entire childhood, without ever once understanding why it mattered until it suddenly, urgently did. She photographed the guarantee language twice, once at an angle to catch the full page, and once close enough to read every word clearly. And she photographed the signature page separately, my name, in my own crooked hand, and the date at the top written correctly this time, month before, day the American order. Grant had used when he substituted the page, rather than the order I had used when I actually signed whatever original document had come before it. She did not know, sitting there in that quiet office, what that particular detail would come to mean. She only knew she told me that something about seeing the two different handwriting habits side by side made the whole deception feel suddenly physically real to her, in a way the words alone had not quite managed. When she finished photographing everything, she put the folder back exactly where she had found it. In the same position, at the same angle, tucked behind the same older files, and closed the drawer. She told me she did not fully understand in that moment why she bothered putting it back so carefully, instead of simply taking it with her. Only that some instinct told her the folder needed to stay where Grant expected it to be, until she had decided entirely on her own terms, and no one else's. Exactly what she intended to do with what she now knew. Grant came home the following evening at his ordinary hour, 6:40, the same 15-minute window he had kept for as long as Josephine had been married to him. Predictable, in that one small way, even as everything else about him had turned out to be built on something false. She told me she had spent the entire day rehearsing what she planned to say, discarding version after version, longer speeches full of accusation, shorter ones that felt too clinical for what she was actually feeling. Until what remained by the time his key turned in the lock was a single sentence stripped down to almost nothing. Because she had decided somewhere in the course of that long day that anything longer would only give him room to talk his way around it. She had not gone to work that day. She told me this detail almost as an afterthought, the way people mention small facts that turn out on reflection to carry more weight than they seemed to at the time. She had called in sick to the flower arrangement shop where she sometimes helped a friend on slow weeks, sat in the apartment through the entire afternoon and rehearsed the sentence out loud to the empty rooms until it stopped sounding rehearsed and started sounding simply true. He set his bag down by the door the way he always did, loosened his tie, asked how her day had gone, and she told me. His voice carried no different weight than any other Tuesday, no tightness, no hesitation. The voice of a man who had absolutely no reason to expect that the floor beneath him had already shifted. She did not answer his question about her day. She walked to the small table by the window instead, the one where they kept the mail, and set the photograph she had printed that afternoon face up on the surface. The full guarantee page, the section that had never appeared in the version her father had been shown. Her own careful highlighting, marking the exact paragraph that mattered most. "What is this doing on our table?" he asked. The same phrase she realized only later that he had once used about a wooden gift at a gallery she had not been present to witness herself, but had heard about secondhand. The particular flatness certain men reach for when they want a question to sound like an answer already settled in their favor. She told me she did not raise her voice. She had promised herself that much, sitting alone at that desk the day before, that whatever came out of her mouth in this moment would not give him the satisfaction of watching her lose composure. Because losing composure was a language he understood and knew exactly how to manage, the way he had managed every difficult moment of their marriage, by simply outlasting her emotion until it wore itself down to something he could redirect. "Explain it to me," she said instead. "Just the one thing. Explain to me why my father's signature is on a page that says nothing about insurance." She told me Grant's face did something she had never seen it do before. Not in 6 years of marriage, not through a single argument or disagreement or difficult conversation about money or family or anything else that had ever come between them. It was not panic exactly. It was closer, she said, to the specific stillness of a man running through several possible sentences at once and finding for the first time in longer than he could probably remember that none of them arrived quickly enough to be useful. He opened his mouth. She watched him open it and watched some version of an explanation begin forming behind his eyes, some phrase about financing structures or standard collateral language, or a misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand, the kind of sentence he had clearly used successfully before on people less prepared than she was, standing there that evening. People who had not spent an entire day rehearsing exactly what they would and would not accept as an answer. And then he closed his mouth again, without a single word coming out of it. The silence that followed, she told me, lasted somewhere between 10 and 15 seconds, though it felt considerably longer than that standing inside it. And she had decided in the days since that those seconds told her more about her marriage than the 6 years that had come before them. A man who had an honest explanation would have offered it immediately, reflexively, the way a person defends themselves against an accusation they believe is unfair. A man with nothing honest to offer needed time to build something, and building something takes longer than telling the truth ever does a difference. She said she could hear now, in every conversation she replayed from their entire marriage. Conversations she had once experienced as simply thoughtful, and now recognized as calculated. "I am not asking you to defend yourself," she said, when the silence had gone on long enough that she understood he was not going to fill it on his own. "I am telling you I already know. I have photographs of every page. I know about the fund. I know about the loan. I know what you were planning to do to my father in that courtroom. And I know now that none of it was ever really about protecting him at all." She told me that what she felt in that moment, more than anger, more even than grief, was something closer to embarrassment. A hot, private shame at how completely she had allowed herself to be managed. How many times she had carried his version of events to me, herself dressed up as concern, never once questioning why she was the one always doing the carrying, the one always smoothing things over, the one always finding the generous explanation before anyone had even asked her to look for one. She did not say any of that to him directly, standing there at the mail table, with the photograph between them. She has told it only to me once, quietly, in Renata's office, and asked me afterward never to repeat it to anyone else. Which is the only reason I have hesitated, even now, over whether I should include it here at all. And why I have chosen, in the end, to include it only in this much and no further. Grant did not answer her question that night. Not with words. He stood by the mail table for a long moment looking at the photograph she had printed, his jaw working the way she said it worked when he was calculating something rather than feeling it. And then he turned and walked into the other room without saying anything at all. Without offering even the beginning of an excuse. And the sound of that silence, she told me, closing behind him like a door, was the exact moment she understood their marriage had already ended, whether or not either of them had said so out loud yet. The judge called the hearing to order at 9:11 that morning. 11 minutes behind schedule, exactly as Renata had predicted while we sat waiting in that hallway outside. I want you to understand something about courtrooms before I tell you what happened inside that one. They are smaller than television makes them look, and quieter. And the quiet is the part nobody warns you about. A particular hush that settles over everyone in the room the moment the judge takes her seat, as though the building itself is holding its breath along with you. The room itself was unremarkable wood paneling that had been refinished at some point in the past decade. County seals mounted on the wall behind the bench, a gallery of perhaps a dozen wooden benches, most of them empty that morning, except for a handful of people there for other matters on the docket, waiting their turn with the particular resigned patience of anyone forced to spend a weekday morning inside a government building. Silas sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the solid, steady presence of him, without either of us needing to say anything about it. His hands folded on his knee the same way mine were, the two of us waiting together. The way we had waited through so many other mornings over 31 years. Judge Marisol Vance presided. A woman perhaps 10 years my junior, with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, and the unhurried manner of someone who had heard every possible variation of family dysfunction cross her bench, and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. Grant sat at the opposing table with his attorney, a younger man in an expensive suit who kept glancing at his phone, even after the judge had entered, and Grant himself sat with the particular composed stillness of a man who believed correctly, based on everything he knew that morning, that the outcome of the next hour was already settled in his favor. Renata began with the medical evaluation, the independent one she had insisted on scheduling the week before, conducted by a geriatric specialist out of Alpine, who had spent 90 minutes with me testing memory, reasoning, basic cognitive function, everything a man in my position might genuinely be losing. Working through a series of standardized assessments I had never once heard of before that appointment. The results were unambiguous. I was, according to every measure the specialist had used, entirely competent, sharper than average for my age by several of the standardized benchmarks, a finding that visibly startled Grant's attorney, who had clearly been working from an assumption that no independent evaluation would contradict the pattern of witnessed incidents his petition described. That contradiction, Renata told the court, was not a mystery. It was, she said, evidence of something else entirely. A documented pattern of deliberate behavior, undertaken for specific, articulable reasons, that she was prepared to explain in full, though she would need the court's patience while she laid out a somewhat unusual set of facts. Facts she acknowledged, even as she introduced them, would sound implausible on their face until the full evidentiary picture had been presented in proper order. Grant's attorney objected to the characterization before she had finished the sentence, calling it speculative and prejudicial, and the judge overruled him without much visible consideration, telling Renata to proceed. And I watched Grant's face during that exchange, watched something flicker there that I recognized because I had spent 5 months cultivating the exact same expression myself. The specific stillness of a man realizing the morning was not unfolding the way he had planned it. A stillness I understood intimately, because I had practiced wearing it in a mirror. Renata walked the court through the timeline methodically, the same way she had walked me through it in her office weeks earlier. The insurance document and its altered second page, the forensic analysis her expert had performed on the paper and ink, confirming the pages had been printed on different equipment at different times. The loan documents Priscilla had provided, showing the shop and building pledged as collateral without my knowledge or consent. She was thorough, unhurried, building the case brick by brick, the way I had once built structures with my own hands, each piece resting on the one beneath it. What Renata could not yet offer, and she said so plainly to the court, was direct evidence tying Grant personally to the alteration of that document. Something beyond circumstantial inference, something that would close the last remaining gap between what we strongly believed and what we could actually prove beyond genuine dispute. Grant's attorney seized on that gap immediately, argued that everything Renata had presented, however troubling, remained a collection of suspicious circumstances rather than proof of the specific fraud she was alleging, and that the medical evaluation, however favorable, did nothing to address the multiple sworn witness statements describing a consistent pattern of cognitive decline observed over several months by people with no evident motive to lie. People who had known me for years and had no financial stake whatsoever in whether I was found competent or not. The judge listened to both arguments without expression. The particular neutral stillness of someone who has learned over many years on the bench not to let her face do any work that her ruling would eventually have to do instead. She asked several pointed questions of Renata about the timeline of the forensic analysis, about the chain of custody for the loan documents, about how Priscilla's identity had been verified, given that the original email had arrived unsigned. She asked Grant's attorney to clarify exactly which witnesses had observed which specific incidents, and when pressing him on dates and details in a way that made him consult his notes more than once, his confidence thinning slightly with each question that required more precision than his prepared summary had provided. The morning stretched past 10 o'clock, then past 10:30, the room settling into the particular grinding patience that courtrooms demand of everyone inside them. Patience I had not expected, and had not adequately prepared myself to sustain. My own hands folded in my lap the entire time, still deliberately still, because some habits once built carefully enough do not simply switch off the moment you no longer need them. It was sometime after 11 while Grant's attorney was midway through a fairly technical argument about the standard of proof required for contested guardianship petitions that I heard the courtroom door open behind me. Quietly, deliberately, the particular careful sound of someone trying not to draw attention to their own arrival, and failing completely, because every head in that gallery turned at once, including mine. Including, I noticed Grant's his sentence trailing off mid-argument as his eyes found whoever had just walked in behind us. His expression shifting into something I had never once seen on his face before. Not at the gallery, not at any dinner table. Not once in all the months I had spent watching him for exactly this kind of unguarded moment. Josephine walked down that center aisle alone. No coat, despite the November chill outside, a single manila folder held against her chest with both arms. The way you carry something you have decided you will not put down until it has done what you brought it there to do. She did not look at Grant as she passed his table, did not so much as turn her head in his direction. She looked at Renata and then at me, and something in her face, seeing me sitting there, seemed to steady itself the moment our eyes actually met. The judge asked with evident curiosity who exactly was interrupting her courtroom, and Renata, recovering faster than I did, stood and identified my daughter, requesting permission for her to approach and be heard given what Renata described as newly discovered evidence directly relevant to the petition currently before the court. Grant's attorney objected immediately, procedurally correctly, arguing that no notice had been filed, that this was precisely the kind of ambush the rules of evidence existed to prevent. The judge considered this for a long moment, looking between Renata's table and Grant's, and then looked directly at Josephine, still standing in the aisle with that folder against her chest, and asked her a single question. "Are you the petitioner's wife?" "I am Josephine," said, "and I have something the court needs to see before it rules on anything my husband has asked for." The judge allowed it over continued objection, citing her discretion in matters directly bearing on a party's credibility. And Josephine walked forward and placed the folder on Renata's table, and Renata opened it and went still, in a way I had not seen her go still in the 2 months I had known her. Reading, quickly, flipping pages, her expression sharpening with each one. What followed took perhaps 20 minutes, though I could not have told you that with any confidence at the time, because 20 minutes stretched and compressed strangely inside that courtroom, the way time does at the exact center of something you have been waiting a very long time to happen. Renata introduced the photographs Josephine had taken, the complete guarantee document, the section that had never appeared in my copy, the signature page with its telling mismatched date format, and laid it directly beside the altered version already in evidence, side by side, the discrepancy, suddenly undeniable. In a way no amount of expert testimony about paper and ink had quite managed to make it before. Then Josephine spoke when the judge asked her to, in a voice I recognized from childhood. The one she used when she had decided something difficult and was not going to be talked out of it. She described finding the folder in her own home, in a drawer she had opened 100 times without incident. She described photographing it page by page before returning it exactly as she had found it, so that nothing would seem disturbed, until she had decided entirely on her own terms what to do with what she now knew. She described confronting her husband directly, and the specific telling silence that had followed, a silence she told the court that she now understood as the only honest answer he had given her in the entire 6 years of their marriage. Her voice did not break once through any of it, though I could see watching her from where I sat exactly what that steadiness was costing her. The particular effort of a person holding a difficult shape together through sheer will. Because falling apart just then was not an option she had left herself. Grant's attorney tried twice to object his way back into control of the room, and both times the judge overruled him with less patience than she had shown an hour earlier. And I watched Grant himself during those minutes, watched him understand in real time exactly how thoroughly his own wife had just dismantled him. Watched the composed stillness he had worn into that courtroom crack apart into something that had no composure left in it at all. The judge did not take long to rule once the arguments concluded. She stated for the record that the newly presented evidence fundamentally altered the credibility calculus underlying the petition, that a pattern of witnessed cognitive incidents took on a materially different character when the person cited as most responsible for observing that pattern was also, by clear evidence, the same person who had orchestrated a scheme to defraud the petition subject of his property and business, and that under those circumstances, she found no basis whatsoever to grant the conservatorship requested. The petition, she said, was denied in full. I do not remember standing up. I remember my hands flat on the table in front of me, and I remember that they were shaking, not the practiced tremor I had perfected over 5 months of careful performance, but something entirely different underneath it. Something that had been waiting the whole time behind the performance for permission to finally be real. Josephine's hand found mine before I had fully registered that she had moved, and she held on, and neither of us said anything at all, because there was nothing that needed saying in that particular silence. Only the fact of her hand in mine, holding on the way a person holds on to something they were not entirely certain they would ever get to hold again. The courtroom around us continued its own business for a moment, the judge making some final notation, The clerk gathering papers, ordinary procedural sounds, filling the space the way they fill any room after something enormous has just finished happening inside it. And I sat inside that ordinary noise with my daughter's hand in mine, and let it pass over both of us, without needing either one of us to say a single word about what we had just survived. What I felt in that moment was not the satisfaction I might have imagined feeling back in September, the first time I let a loop slip and shatter on my own workbench floor. It was something quieter, harder to name, a kind of hollowed-out relief with no clean edges to it, the particular weightlessness of setting down something you had carried so long and so carefully that your body had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight without it. Forgotten what your own shoulders were supposed to feel like when they were not braced against something. Grant left the courtroom alone. His attorney gathered papers at their table for several minutes after the judge left, speaking to him in a low voice I could not hear, and Grant answered in monosyllables, his eyes fixed somewhere past the far wall, refusing, it seemed, to look toward our table even once. When he finally walked out through those double doors, no one followed him. Not his attorney, not a single person from that gallery, and the sound of the door closing behind him, heavy on its hinges, was the last sound I ever heard him make in a room I was also standing in. The lease on the apartment above the laundromat in Astoria, wherever that particular fact belongs in someone else's story, was never going to be part of ours. Josephine and Nora moved into a rental 4 blocks from the shop in early December. Close enough that Nora could walk over most afternoons after school, close enough that some mornings when I unlocked the front door at 7, I could hear the two of them already awake in the little house on Cypress Street. A sound I had not let myself imagine hearing again since the week my wife died. The move had not been an easy decision for either of them, and I want to be honest about that, rather than smoothing it over into something simpler than it was. Josephine had built a life in Santa Fe, a career of sorts, a circle of friends, who had known her as Grant's wife for 6 years and would need time to know her as anyone else. Nora had a school, a room she had decorated herself, a set of habits a 7-year-old builds without ever noticing she is building them. Neither of them left any of that behind lightly. And I never once asked either of them to. Only offered the house on Cypress Street when it came up for rent, and let them decide for themselves what they wanted to do with the offer. Grant's attorney filed the divorce paperwork the same week as the hearing, and Josephine did not contest any of it, did not ask for anything beyond what the law entitled her to as a matter of course, a fact her own attorney, a sharp young woman named Delia Ochoa, who Renata had recommended, found almost unbelievable given everything that had come out in that courtroom. Josephine's answer to her, which she later repeated to me, was that she had not come out of this wanting to win anything from Grant. She had come out of it wanting only to be entirely, finally done with needing anything from him at all. That particular Tuesday morning, the one I actually want to tell you about, was ordinary in almost every way that mattered. I opened the shop at 7 the way I always had. I set that day's work on the bench in the order I meant to do it, a lady's longine with a sticking crown, a mantel clock that needed its escapement cleaned. Nora arrived a little after 8, let herself in through the front door the way she had permission to do now, sketchbook under one arm, and climbed onto the stool across from me without needing to be told which one was hers. She had started drawing again in October, not long after the hearing, a fact Josephine mentioned to me quietly one evening, the way you mentioned something you have been afraid to say out loud, in case saying it undid it. The first new drawing had been of the shop's front window, the whole row of clocks visible through the glass, every hand on every face drawn correctly except one, the tall mahogany regulator in the center, which she had drawn with no hands at all, just a blank round face. Because she had not yet decided, she told me what time it should say. I watched Nora work that morning, her tongue caught slightly between her teeth the way it always was when she concentrated, sketching the longine from an angle that showed both the crystal and the crown. And I thought, not for the first time, about how differently a life turns out from how you expect it to, when you are standing inside the wreckage of it, certain there is nothing left worth salvaging. Josephine dropped by around 9 on her way to the flower shop where she had taken a permanent position managing weekend arrangements, and she stood for a moment in the doorway, watching her daughter draw before either of them noticed I was watching both of them. And something about the shape of that particular morning, The ordinary, unremarkable shape of it settled into me, the way the good kind of tiredness settles into you after a long day of honest work. "I want to be here for a minute," I told them both, and stepped away from the bench. Toward the front window, toward the tall case clock that had stood silent in that spot for what would be by the calendar nearly 21 months, that Thursday. I opened the case. I checked the weights still hanging exactly where I'd left them the morning I found Lorraine on the kitchen floor, undisturbed by anyone in all that time, because I had told every employee I never had and every customer who ever asked that the piece was simply not for sale. Not able to explain, even to myself, why I could not bring myself to say the rest of it. I set the pendulum swinging with 2 fingers, the way my own father had taught me when I was younger than Nora is now. And I wound the weights back up to their proper height, and I listened to the tick begin again. Uneven at first, the way any mechanism sounds when it wakes from a long sleep, before settling within a few dozen beats into the same steady rhythm it must have kept for the 60 years before that January morning it stopped. I did not cry doing it. I want that recorded plainly, the way Josephine recorded her own composure to me once in Renata's office. What I felt instead, standing in front of that clock with my hand still resting on its case, was something closer to an apology I had never managed to say out loud while Lorraine was alive to hear it. An apology for every time I had let her caution be laughed away at a dinner table instead of taken seriously. For every year I had mistaken enduring things quietly for actually protecting the people I loved. That particular regret has not gone away, and I do not expect it ever fully will, not entirely, not in whatever years I have left to sit with it. Some clocks once stopped, you can start again. Some mistakes you simply learn to carry forward, ticking along beside you for as long as you keep walking. Grandpa Nora called from across the shop, not looking up from her sketchbook. "Is it telling the right time now?" I told her it was close enough, and that close enough was usually the best any clock or any man could honestly manage. And she considered that answer with the particular seriousness only a child gives to sentences she has decided are more important than they first sound. And then she went back to drawing, and Josephine laughed quietly at something neither of them explained to me, and the shop filled with the ordinary tick of every clock in it. All of them, for the first time in nearly 2 years, keeping time together in that small room on Elm Street. 3 generations of it, ticking on into whatever came next. The regulator in the front window still runs. I check it every morning now, first thing before the coffee, before the lights, my thumb resting a moment on the glass the way hers used to. Some mornings it gains a few seconds. Some mornings it loses them. I let it. A clock that keeps perfect time forever was never the kind my family ever made, and I have stopped wanting one that does. For most of my life, I believed that silence, patient and steady, was how a man protected the people he loved. I believed enduring quietly was its own kind of strength, that a household stayed whole because someone was willing to swallow what needed saying, year after year, without complaint. I do not believe that anymore. Not entirely. I have come to think that silence can be a shelter, and it can also be a lie we tell ourselves about who we are protecting, and whom we are actually just sparing the discomfort of speaking. My wife knew the difference before I did. My daughter learned it faster than I ever managed to. I am still learning it some mornings better than others. I think about the 2 of them often. The woman who left me a warning I was too slow to hear, and the daughter who finally refused to stay quiet when it mattered most. I am grateful to God for both of them, more than these words can carry, and I ask Him most nights to keep watch over the 2 of them the way He has kept watch over this family through every year we did not deserve it. I ask Him too for patience with myself, for whatever time I have left on this earth, to be the kind of man who speaks when speaking is the harder, truer thing to do. Some wounds do not close all the way. God does not promise that they will. He only promises we do not have to carry them alone. If you were me standing in that courtroom, letting people believe you were losing your mind so you could quietly save everything you had spent a lifetime building, would you have done the same? Or would you have found the courage to speak sooner and spared yourself the year it cost you, the year it cost your family? There is no clean answer to that question. I have turned it over more times than I can count, and some mornings I land on one side of it, and some mornings the other. Tell me in the comments below, honestly, where you land. I read every single one, and if this story found its way into a corner of your own life, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. It costs you nothing. It might mean everything to them. Thank you for staying until the very last word.